September 1996. A red Dodge Viper lice flipped on Mulholland Highway, reduced to shattered glass. The driver crawling from the wreckage, legally intoxicated and fueled by cocaine, was a catastrophic train wreck of a human being. Yet to tens of millions of Americans, this same man was Dr. Frasier Crane, the smartest man on television. Kelsey Grammer was paid millions to portray the absolute pinnacle of rational thought, while his own reality was a collapsing structure of severe addiction and profound unaddressed trauma. However, viewing this simply as a tragic irony of a flawed genius is a critical misjudgment. The 1996 crash was not an impulsive mistake. It was the inevitable detonation of a 2-decade-long system of self-destruction. And more importantly, it was a system fully subsidized by the entertainment industry. The true story of Kelsey Grammer is not about a brilliant man losing his way. It is the anatomy of a massive industrial machine, Paramount and NBC, that watched its star violently spiral for years. Instead of halting production, they paid exorbitant insurance premiums, manipulated shooting schedules, deployed a massive PR defense, and eventually handed him a record-breaking $1.6 million per episode. When an industry is willing to bankroll and shield an individual's self-destruction to protect a billion-dollar sitcom franchise, the line between supporting an artist and enabling a disaster completely vanishes. Frasier Crane was a masterpiece of fiction. Kelsey Grammer was a man kept functioning by a Hollywood ecosystem designed to exploit his demons until the wheels literally came off. Alan Kelsey Grammer was born on February 21st, 1955 in St. Thomas, U.S. Virgin Islands. His father, Frank Allen Grammer Jr., was a musician and the proprietor of a local establishment named Greer's Place. His mother, Sally Cranmer, worked as a singer and actress. The geographic isolation of the Caribbean setting did not yield domestic tranquility. The marriage dissolved shortly after the birth of his younger sister, Karen. Sally relocated her 2 young children to the mainland United States, settling in New Jersey to reside with her parents, Gordon and Evangeline Cranmer. This geographic and familial fracture established a permanent baseline of instability. In the absence of his biological father, his grandfather, Gordon Cranmer, became the central male archetype and the primary psychological anchor of Grammer's formative years. The structure of the household relied entirely on this surrogate paternal figure. In 1968, that structure collapsed. Gordon Cranmer died of cancer. Grammer was 12 years old. The psychological vacuum created by the loss of a primary caregiver is profound, but it was immediately compounded by a secondary, far more violent shock. Later that same year, Frank Grammer Jr. was murdered in St. Thomas. The socio-political and economic climate of the U.S. Virgin Islands in the late 1960s was complex, but the murder itself was rooted in localized, senseless violence. Frank Grammer was shot twice outside his home by Arthur Niles, a local taxi driver grappling with severe documented psychiatric instability. Niles had previously expressed hostilities toward Frank Grammer before executing the fatal attack. Within a single calendar year, the 13-year-old Kelsey Grammer was stripped of both the man who raised him and the biological father he barely knew. 2 foundational male figures were erased from his reality, one by biology, the other by a bullet. Despite the total fracturing of his family unit, Grammer possessed an undeniable raw theatrical intellect. His baritone voice and physical presence were highly unusual for his age. In 1973, he auditioned for and was accepted into the Juilliard School in New York City. At the time, Juilliard's drama division was under the influence of legendary producer John Houseman and the strict classical training methodologies of Michel Saint-Denis. Grammer was placed into Group 6, an elite cohort of drama students. The Juilliard curriculum in the 1970s was a punishing, relentless ecosystem. It was explicitly designed to break down an actor's pre-existing ego and rebuild it through rigid physical, vocal, and textual discipline. It demanded absolute subservience to the craft. Grammer actively rejected this discipline. A persistent myth frequently repeated in entertainment journalism suggests that Grammer left Juilliard because he was incapacitated by grief over his family tragedies. Institutional realities contradict this narrative. Grammer did not leave Juilliard. He was formally expelled. His dismissal was not the tragic withdrawal of a mourning son. It was the administrative result of chronic absenteeism, deliberate insubordination, and a profound lack of professional focus. While his peers were subjecting themselves to rigorous movement and speech classes, Grammer was frequently riding motorcycles erratically through Manhattan traffic and sleeping on the lawns of Central Park. He engaged in a sustained campaign of institutional rebellion. This was self-destruction in motion. He was actively sabotaging his own elite opportunity, proving early on that he possessed a mechanism that would reliably dismantle his own success whenever he approached it. The expulsion was an act of arrogance, not an act of mourning. Following his expulsion from Juilliard, Grammer moved to the West Coast, taking an internship at the Old Globe Theater in San Diego. He was adrift, attempting to forge a career purely on raw talent, without the backing of formal institutional credentials. Then the timeline reached July 1st, 1975. Karen Grammer, Kelsey's younger sister, was 18 years old. She had recently graduated from high school and deferred her college enrollment, opting to take a gap year in Colorado Springs. She was employed at a local Red Lobster restaurant. During the first week of July, 3 men, Freddie Glenn, Michael Coburn, and John V. Rush, were engaged in a low-key, allies spree of violent crime across Colorado Springs. They had already committed a homicide at a motel days prior. On the night of July 1st, the trio targeted the Red Lobster for an armed robbery. The robbery was executed haphazardly. As the perpetrators fled the rear of the restaurant, they encountered Karen Grammer. She was sitting outside waiting for her boyfriend to finish his shift. Fearing that she had seen their faces and could identify their vehicle, the men abducted her at gunpoint. The subsequent events, detailed extensively in Colorado State court records, are of exceptional brutality. Karen was forced into the vehicle and transported to a remote, unlit area near the Buena Vista Mobile Home Park. She was repeatedly and violently sexually assaulted by the men. Following the assaults, Freddie Glenn, the ringleader, determined she could not be left alive. He stabbed Karen Grammer repeatedly in the throat, the back, and her hands as she attempted to defend herself. They abandoned her in the dark. Despite suffering fatal hemorrhaging, Karen Grammer did not die immediately. Forensic analysis and police reports confirm she managed to drag herself a significant distance toward a nearby trailer, leaving a 50-yard trail of blood in an attempt to find help before ultimately expiring. The procedural aftermath of a violent homicide places a sterile administrative burden on the next of kin. Kelsey Grammer, 20 years old, recently expelled and lacking any solid institutional foundation, was required to fly to Colorado. He was escorted into the El Paso County morgue. He was the family member tasked with looking at the violently mutilated remains of his 18-year-old sister to provide the state with an official identification. Forensic psychologists and trauma specialists point out that visual identification of a violently murdered family member is one of the most severe psychological shocks a human brain can endure. It frequently triggers acute, permanent post-traumatic stress disorder. The imagery bypasses rational processing and embeds itself directly into the brain's amygdala, altering the individual's baseline neurochemistry for the rest of their life. Following the identification, Grammer had to navigate the protracted, agonizing judicial process. Freddie Glenn and his accomplices were eventually apprehended, tried, and convicted. Glenn was sentenced to the gas chamber, a sentence later commuted to life imprisonment when the Colorado Supreme Court briefly struck down the death penalty. Grammer sat through the legal proceedings, absorbing the forensic details of his sister's final hours. He returned to the theater. He secured a position at the renowned Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis. He began performing heavy classical roles, immersing himself in Shakespearean tragedies. He was playing Macduff and Richard II, articulating the grief of fictional kings while compartmentalizing an unparalleled reality of personal horror. It was during this period at the Guthrie that Grammer's alcohol consumption evolved from youthful indiscretion to a daily, systematic requirement. He established the operational model that would define his career: the highly functioning, articulate alcoholic. He could deliver complex iambic pentameter flawlessly on stage and drink himself into oblivion immediately afterward. The statistical probability of one family enduring 3 separate catastrophic unnatural deaths is infinitesimally small. Yet, the sequence was not complete. In 1980, Grammer's twin half-brothers Stephen and Billy, the sons of his late father Frank, were scuba diving off the coast of St. Thomas. They were diving in the exact geographical location where their father had been assassinated 12 years earlier. The specific circumstances of the dive remain technically unverified due to the lack of surviving witnesses, but marine reports indicate that Stephen suffered a fatal air embolism, a catastrophic expansion of air in the bloodstream, caused by a rapid, uncontrolled ascent to the surface. Seeing his brother in distress, Billy reportedly dove back down into the depths to attempt a rescue. Neither brother survived the incident. Stephen's body was eventually recovered from the water. Billy's body was never found. He was permanently swallowed by the Caribbean Sea. By his 25th birthday, Kelsey Grammer had lost his grandfather to illness, his father to a targeted assassination, his sister to a sadistic kidnapping and murder, and his 2 half-brothers to the ocean. Categorizing this sequence of events merely as a tragic backstory is a failure of analytical rigor. From a clinical psychiatric standpoint, this level of sustained, inescapable trauma initiates a highly specific destructive defense mechanism: survivor's guilt. Survivor's guilt is a recognized psychological condition often associated with combat veterans or survivors of mass casualty events. It is not simply a passive feeling of sadness for being alive. It is an active, corrosive, subconscious conviction that one's own survival is inherently unjust, illegitimate, and fundamentally deserving of punishment. When applied to Grammer, this psychological framework radically changes the interpretation of his subsequent decades in Hollywood. Survivor's guilt frequently manifests in chronic self-medication, extreme risk-taking, and behavior designed to court ruin. When an individual internalizes the belief that they should be dead alongside their family, success feels like a violation of the natural order. Therefore, when Grammer later began consuming vast quantities of alcohol and cocaine, he was not a Hollywood hedonist indulging in the excesses of fame. He was a traumatized organism utilizing heavy chemical agents to shut down a hyperactive nervous system. He was attempting to temporarily silence the cognitive dissonance of his own existence. Cocaine functions as a powerful dopamine agonist, artificially overriding the brain's depleted reward D centers, which are often heavily damaged by prolonged grief. Alcohol acts as a central nervous system depressant, slowing down the intrusive thoughts and the hypervigilance generated by PTSD. The substance abuse was an industrial-grade anesthetic. Many psychologists would argue his self-destructive behavior was an unconscious manifestation of survivor's guilt. He appeared to be aligning his external reality with a dark internal conviction that he was meant for the same destruction that claimed his family. Acknowledging this psychological pathology does not legally or morally absolve Kelsey Grammer of responsibility for the collateral damage he would soon inflict upon others, nor does it excuse the danger he posed to the public when behind the wheel of a vehicle. Survivor's guilt explains the compulsion. It does not excuse the action. However, examining this mechanism is absolutely critical for dismantling the shallow narrative of the troubled television star. Grammer's ultimate tragedy was not that he was weak. His tragedy was that he possessed a formidable intellect, a commanding physical presence, and an immense capacity for survival. Yet he weaponized those very traits against himself. He built a towering, impenetrable fortress of charisma and theatrical skill to face the cameras, while simultaneously and actively setting fire to the foundations from the inside. He was fully equipped to become the most successful actor in television history, and entirely programmed to destroy him. In 1984, the American television landscape was dominated by a highly specific economic engine, the multi-camera network sitcom. Shows like Cheers were not merely entertainment programs. They were colossal financial institutions generating hundreds of millions of dollars in advertising revenue and establishing syndication deals that would underwrite entire studio divisions for decades. When Kelsey Grammer walked onto the set of Cheers during its third season, he was stepping into the seat-icy enter of this industrial apparatus. He was hired to play Dr. Frasier Crane, a character originally conceived as a temporary narrative obstacle. A pompous, Harvard-educated psychiatrist meant to temporarily disrupt the central romantic dynamic between the show's leads. The character of Frasier was constructed on a foundation of intellectual arrogance, masking profound emotional incompetence. The comedic engine of the character relied on the audience recognizing that despite his elite psychiatric credentials, Frasier Crane possessed absolutely no functional ability to manage his own life or navigate basic human relationships. The tragic irony was absolute, though entirely hidden from the American public. The man delivering perfectly timed, articulate monologues about Freudian defense mechanisms and cognitive behavioral therapy was actively relying on heavy narcotics to remain conscious. Grammer's survival mechanism, forged in the aftermath of his family's catastrophic sequence of violent deaths, had calcified into a rigid daily routine of severe substance abuse. Cocaine was utilized as a neurochemical stimulant to guarantee his physical arrival at the Paramount Studios lot. Alcohol was deployed subsequently as a central nervous system depressant to counteract the cocaine and simulate a state of equilibrium. Operating a multi-camera sitcom is akin to managing a highly calibrated factory line. The schedule is unforgiving, dictated by rigid tape days, live studio audiences, and union regulations. A compromised lead actor does not merely inconvenience a production, he threatens a multi-million-dollar weekly supply chain. Yet, instead of halting this machinery when Grammer's addiction became undeniably apparent, the production environment adapted to accommodate the pathology. The narrative frequently peddled by Hollywood public relations frames the actions of Grammer's castmates during this era as acts of profound familial loyalty. Co-stars would physically prop him up during scenes. They would feed him his lines off camera when his short-term memory failed due to intoxication. Interventions were staged. However, from a structural and systemic perspective, this was not rehabilitation. It was the absolute definition of enabling. There's a critical distinction between a support system and an enabler system. A support system demands accountability and enforces boundaries to halt destructive behavior. An enabler system absorbs the collateral damage of the destructive behavior so the individual never has to face the consequences, allowing the baseline pathology to continue uninterrupted. The cast and crew of Cheers were placed in an impossible position by their corporate superiors. By keeping Grammer functional enough to deliver a punchline before the director called cut, they inadvertently insulated him from the very collapse that might have forced an actual medical intervention. The studio's priority was not the neurological health of their employee. It was the delivery of 24 episodes per season to NBC. This corporate complicity escalated significantly as Grammer's private chaos began spilling into the jurisdiction of law enforcement. The protective bubble of a soundstage cannot repel police sirens. In 1988, Grammer was arrested in Los Angeles for driving under the influence and possession of cocaine. The judicial system mandated a 30-day sentence in a rehabilitation facility, followed by probation. The response from Paramount Television and the network was not an ultimatum demanding verifiable long-term sobriety. Instead, the response was an exercise in corporate risk management. When an actor on a highly profitable network show faces criminal charges and demonstrates severe chemical dependency, they become a liability to the production's insurance underwriters. Standard completion bonds and cast insurance policies are threatened. Paramount's solution was to absorb the exorbitant penalty premiums demanded by insurers like Lloyd's of London. They adjusted rehearsal schedules to accommodate his court dates and abbreviated rehab stints. The studio effectively monetized his addiction, calculating that the millions of dollars generated by the Frasier Crane character and syndication vastly outweighed the legal fees, the insurance hikes, and the logistical nightmares caused by the actor playing him. By 1990, Grammer was arrested again, this time for violating his probation. He had failed to attend mandatory counseling sessions and was caught with a vial of cocaine. He was sentenced to 90 days of house arrest. Even under these conditions, the industrial machine did not pause. The studio arranged for his electronic monitoring bracelet to be accommodated during production. He was allowed to continue filming, his ankle monitor carefully hidden beneath the tailored trousers of his character's expensive suits. The message delivered to Grammer by the Hollywood executive structure was unambiguous. His talent rendered him entirely immune to the standard consequences of criminal behavior. This dangerous paradigm reached its absolute apex in 1993, a year that serves as the ultimate stress test for the concept of corporate enabling. As Cheers concluded its historic run, NBC and Paramount made an unprecedented financial gamble. They greenlit a spin-off series, Frasier, placing the character at the center of his own universe. The studio was effectively placing the cornerstone of its highly lucrative Thursday night comedy block squarely onto the shoulders of an active, volatile addict. Simultaneously, a crisis emerged that eclipsed any previous DUI or drug possession charge. As the Frasier spinoff was launching into production, Grammer was accused of statutory rape. The allegations stemmed from an incident purportedly involving a 15-year-old girl who had been hired as a babysitter. This was not a victimless crime or a standard Hollywood tale of excess. This was an allegation of severe predatory felony condo, UCT. In a functioning ethical system, an accusation of this magnitude against the lead of a newly launched multi-million-dollar family-friendly sitcom would trigger immediate suspension pending a thorough legal and internal investigation. To analyze the studio's reaction accurately, one must navigate the treacherous boundary between protecting an employee's legal right to the presumption of innocence and engaging in toxic corporate cover-ups. Grammer vehemently denied the allegations, characterizing the situation as a calculated extortion attempt. In 1995, following an investigation, a New Jersey grand jury formally declined to indict Grammer, citing a lack of prosecutable evidence. From a strict jurisprudential standpoint, the grand jury's refusal to indict means the state could not meet the burden of proof required to bring the case to trial. Grammer was legally cleared of criminal prosecution. A corporation is legally justified and, in many labor frameworks, required to maintain the employment of an individual who has not been formally charged or convicted of a crime. To fire him based solely on an unindicted allegation would have invited a massive breach of contract lawsuit. However, the mechanism of Hollywood enabling does not operate strictly within the confines of a courtroom. It operates in the realm of public perception and institutional leverage. Paramount and NBC did not simply allow the legal process to play out objectively. They actively deployed their formidable public relations apparatus to shield the asset. The grand jury's decision was immediately weaponized by studio publicists not just as a legal defense, but as a total moral exoneration. The allegation was aggressively minimized in the press, buried under an avalanche of carefully placed puff pieces highlighting the intellectual sophistication of the Frasier series. The crisis management teams ensured that entertainment journalists focused on Grammer's Emmy nominations rather than his police records. The studio used the legal minimum, the lack of an indictment, as a mandate to aggressively promote a man battling severe demons as the ultimate paragon of American upper-class rationality. This is the exact juncture where the comparison to other Hollywood redemption narratives reveals a stark, uncomfortable truth. The entertainment industry frequently congratulates itself for its capacity for forgiveness, citing figures like Robert Downey Jr. as evidence of the system's benevolence. This comparison is structurally flawed. During the 1990s, Robert Downey Jr.'s addiction rendered him a total industrial liability. Despite his undeniable talent, his unreliability breached the threshold of corporate tolerance. He was fired from the television series Ally McBeal. He became legally uninsurable, meaning no major studio could secure the bonds necessary to cast him in a feature film. The industry system systematically ejected him. He was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to serve time in the California Substance Abuse Treatment Facility and State Prison in Corcoran. The Hollywood machinery completely abandoned him until he proved his sobriety over an extended period outside of their ecosystem. Downey's eventual return and ascension to the role of Iron Man, occurred only after he had faced the absolute unmitigated consequences of the penal system and the free market. Kelsey Grammer's trajectory offers the exact antithesis of this process. Grammer never faced the structural rejection that Downey experienced. Grammer never became uninsurable because Paramount was always willing to underwrite the risk. Grammer was never fired. He was promoted during the absolute lowest points of his addiction while he was violating probation and generating severe legal controversies. The system rewarded him. The success of Frasier was astronomical. The show accumulated an unprecedented 37 Primetime Emmy Awards. Grammer himself was repeatedly honored as the finest comedic actor of his generation. As the ratings climbed, his leverage over the network became absolute. By the final seasons of the show, Grammer had negotiated a salary of $1.6 million per episode, making him the highest paid actor in the history of television at that time. The industry did not grant Kelsey Grammer a second chance. It engineered an environment where he never had to utilize a first chance. The Hollywood enabling machine is not driven by loyalty, empathy, or a belief in artistic redemption. It is driven purely by the mathematics of syndication. As long as the fictional Dr. Frasier Crane continued to deliver elite demographic ratings and advertising revenue, the actual Kelsey Grammer was permitted to operate above the law, above ethical scrutiny, and above the basic requirements of human accountability. He was shielded in a golden sarcophagus, heavily medicated, massively compensated, and fundamentally trapped by an industry that found his destruction highly profitable. The most formidable obstacle to treating severe addiction is rarely a lack of financial resources or the physical severity of chemical dependency. The most impenetrable barrier to clinical recovery is a highly functioning, exceptionally articulate intellect. When an individual possesses a genius-level capacity for rationalization, they bypass simple denial and construct a sophisticated, philosophically complex fortress around their pathology. They weaponize their own cognitive abilities to outsmart the therapeutic frameworks designed to save them. The intellect that allowed Kelsey Grammer to memorize pages of dense psychiatric dialogue for Frasier served as the exact instrument he utilized to architect his own prolonged psychological evasion. The mechanisms Grammer deployed to simulate a functional reality while experiencing fundamental internal collapse relied heavily on social constructs rather than purely chemical ones. The primary tool in this operational arsenal was the institution of marriage. Over the course of his adult life, Grammer engaged in a chaotic, highly publicized trail of matrimonial legalities that the entertainment press routinely categorized as standard Hollywood tabloid fodder. This categorization fundamentally misinterprets his behavioral pathology. Marriage serves strictly as external psychological scaffolding. He repeatedly utilized spouses to outsource his own stabilization, expecting these legal unions to uphold the structural integrity of a man actively eroding his own psychological foundations. The chronological progression of these relationships perfectly mirrors the escalation of his internal crises. His first marriage to dance instructor Doreen Alderman commenced in 1982, aligning precisely with the period when his reliance on alcohol and cocaine calcified into a daily necessity following the violent sequence of familial deaths in the 1970s. The union produced a daughter, Spencer, yet the marriage itself functioned effectively as a phantom structure. Grammer and Alderman held the legal status of a married couple for 8 years, but physical cohabitation lasted less than 2. Geographic and emotional distance was a functional requirement. Grammer could not sustain the intimate daily scrutiny of a partner while simultaneously managing a severe, active addiction. The divorce was finalized in 1990, neatly clearing the legal board, just as his conflicts with the Los Angeles Police Department regarding DUI and cocaine possession charges reached critical mass. The subsequent marriage to Lee Ann Suhaney in 1992 represented a dramatic escalation in the severity of his interpersonal chaos. The relationship was remarkably brief, lasting exactly 1 year, and characterized by intense mutual toxicity. Grammer publicly alleged severe physical and emotional abuse, claiming Suhaney had fired a weapon at him and repeatedly threatened his life. He filed for an annulment while she was pregnant, a legal maneuver that culminated in a devastating sequence of events where Suhaney attempted suicide, resulting in a miscarriage. The Hollywood public relations apparatus, deeply invested in protecting the newly launched Frasier franchise, aggressively contained the horrifying details of this matrimonial collapse. From a psychological perspective, the Suhaney marriage is highly revealing. It exposed the absolute failure of Grammer's judgment during the peak of his addiction. He remained completely incapable of selecting a healthy environment or maintaining a safe perimeter around his own life, drawn instead into dynamics of extreme conflict that mirrored his internal state of constant crisis. This pattern of seeking salvation through matrimonial architecture reached its most complex, commodified, and ultimately destructive stage with his third wife, Camille Donatacci. A former MTV dancer and model, she married Grammer in 1997, occupying the direct aftermath of his near-fatal 1996 car crash and his highly publicized stint in rehabilitation. The Grammer-Donatacci union was immediately packaged and presented to the public as the ultimate Hollywood redemption narrative. The media cast her as the definitive stabilizing force, the woman who finally tamed the erratic genius. For over a decade, they projected an impenetrable image of upper-class domestic perfection, acquiring massive real estate portfolios and expanding their family via surrogacy. The facade relied entirely on a mutual agreement of curated reality. When that agreement fractured, the collapse was spectacular and deeply humiliating. The dissolution of their 14-year marriage coincided directly with Camille's casting on the inaugural season of the Bravo reality television program, The Real Housewives of Beverly Hills, in 2010. The juxtaposition exposed a brutal reality. For 20 years, Grammer meticulously controlled his public image through scripted, highly intellectualized sitcom environments. The transition to reality television abruptly stripped away that odd control. His private life, his infidelities, and his profound emotional detachment were suddenly broadcast through an unfiltered, sensationalist lens. The divorce transformed into a public bloodletting, exposing the absolute hollowness of the redemption narrative he had constructed. Camille had not cured his underlying trauma. She had functioned as a highly effective, highly compensated manager of his public persona until the arrangement lost its viability for both parties. The serial marriages represent only the secondary layer of Grammer's psychological evasion. The primary defense mechanism, the ultimate manifestation of his intellectual arrogance, materialized as a direct ideological war against established psychiatric and rehabilitative protocols. The immediate aftermath of the September 1996 accident in Agoura Hills forced a temporary disruption of his autonomy. Following the crash of his Dodge Viper, the corporate shield provided by Paramount and NBC could no longer completely deflect law enforcement and public scrutiny. An intervention became a logistical necessity for the studio. Grammer checked into the Betty Ford Center in Rancho Mirage, California, one of the most prestigious addiction treatment facilities globally. He completed a standard 30-day program. The mainstream press immediately signaled a complete capitulation, declaring him rehabilitated and sober. The clinical reality of addiction treatment, particularly the Minnesota model utilized by institutions like the Betty Ford Center, relies heavily on the foundational principles of Alcoholics Anonymous, AA, and the 12-step program. Step 1 of this program serves as the absolute non-negotiable cornerstone of long-term recovery, the admission of powerlessness over the addiction, and the acknowledgement that life has become unmanageable. This single conceptual requirement represents the exact ideological antithesis of Kelsey Grammer's entire psychological construct. For an individual suffering from PI, found untreated survivor's guilt, control acts as the only valid currency of survival. Having lost his grandfather, father, sister, and brothers to forces completely outside of his control, cancer, murder, kidnapping, and the ocean, Grammer's neurological response was to exert a hyper-rigid, tyrannical control over his remaining existence. His addiction functioned, in a twisted sense, as an extreme exercise in control. He selected the specific chemical substances, he dictated the dosage, and he determined the exact moment to shut his central nervous system down. Sitting in a clinical environment in Rancho Mirage and publicly declaring absolute powerlessness presented a psychological impossibility. It required dismantling the exact armor that had kept him functioning, however dysfunctionally, since 1975. Grammer refused the surrender. He initiated a rebellion. Following his release from the Betty Ford Center, Grammer engaged in an act of staggering psychological defiance. He publicly and vehemently rejected the Alcoholics Anonymous methodology. In numerous subsequent interviews, he disparaged the organization, explicitly labeling it a cult and fundamentally rejecting its core philosophy. He argued aggressively against the medical consensus of addiction as an incurable lifelong disease that requires daily submission to a higher power or structural framework. He utilized his formidable intellect to dissect the 12-step literature, isolating perceived philosophical loopholes and logical fallacies to justify his permanent defection from the program. He systematically replaced the institutional framework of AA with a self-designed, highly idiosyncratic protocol. He declared absolute victory over his cocaine addiction, but openly admitted to resuming the daily consumption of alcohol. He framed this decision not as a relapse, but as a definitive triumph of intellectual willpower. He stated on the record that he simply drank every day, maintained a specific quota, and successfully avoided losing control. This specific operational strategy stands as the most critical piece of evidence regarding the true trajectory of Kelsey Grammer. It constitutes the ultimate self-deception, meticulously wrapped in the vocabulary of victory. Within the field of addiction medicine and psychiatry, the concept of a severe, late-stage, chemically dependent individual successfully transitioning back to controlled social drinking is classified as a dangerous, statistically negligible myth. It is the precise rationalization addicts universally employ to authorize their inevitable return to the substance. Grammer, a man who flipped a high-performance sports car while severely intoxicated, who required his castmates to physically hold him upright on a multi-camera soundstage, and who utilized heavy narcotics for 2 decades to suppress the trauma of multiple violent family deaths, publicly claimed he could now safely consume central nervous system depressants every single day simply by deciding to employ moderation. The level of cognitive dissonance required to maintain this belief system is staggering. He effectively decided that his intellect operated at a level superior to the biological realities of the disease of addiction. He believed his mind, the same instrument that so brilliantly animated the psychiatric expertise of Dr. Frasier Crane, possessed the power to rewrite the biochemical rules of chemical dependency. He rejected the established recovery frameworks because they demanded baseline humility, and humility registered in his traumatized brain as the exact vulnerability that had resulted in the violent deaths of his family members. This self-imposed daily drinking discipline offers no actual cure. It represents a meticulously managed hostage situation. It enforces a state of perpetual, exhausting psychological compromise. By consuming alcohol daily while striving desperately to avoid public collapse, he commits immense cognitive resources to managing the exact substance that nearly destroyed his life and career. He remains permanently tethered to the alcohol, proving definitively that the chemical still dictates the daily parameters of his existence. The dragon remains undefeated. He simply constructed a highly functional, extremely lucrative cage to live inside with it. The overarching irony remains sharp, absolute, and inescapable. Grammer spent 20 years portraying a character who passionately advocated for the absolute necessity of psychoanalysis. Frasier Crane firmly believed that examining the subconscious and confronting unresolved historical traumas served as the only legitimate path to a functional human existence. The fictional psychiatrist would have spent entire television seasons systematically dismantling the dangerous rationalizations of a patient who claimed they could control a severe decades-long addiction through sheer intellectual arrogance and daily moderated consumption. Frasier would have easily categorized the serial marriages as textbook attempts to avoid internal silence. He would have instantly diagnosed the aggressive rejection of a clinical support group as a classic manifestation of narcissistic defense. The man who brought that psychiatrist to life absolutely refused to apply a single one of those doctrines to his own reality. He stood before the American public, collected unprecedented television salaries, secured his Emmy Awards, and successfully marketed the narrative of the reformed survivor. He convinced the corporate apparatus and the general public that he had beaten the system entirely on his own terms. But by rejecting the fundamental requirement of psychological surrender, Kelsey Grammer ensured that he would forever remain the architect and the sole inmate of his own psychological prison. He continues to manage his daily intake, perpetually outrunning the ghosts of 1975, and proving definitively that the most dangerous weapon a severely traumatized mind can possess is a brilliant, entirely unyielding intellect. In July 2014, the intricate psychological architecture Kelsey Grammer spent decades constructing collided violently with historical reality. The setting was a sterile administrative room operating under the jurisdiction of the Colorado Department of Corrections. Freddie Glenn, the perpetrator responsible for the 1975 abduction, systemic sexual assault, and murder of 18-year-old Karen Grammer, faced a formal parole board. The legal mechanics forcing this confrontation require precise documentation to grasp the protracted nature of the trauma. Glenn initially received a death sentence, slated for execution via the gas chamber. The definitive closure promised by capital punishment evaporated in 1978 when the Colorado Supreme Court briefly invalidated state death penalty statutes. Consequently, Glenn's sentence converted automatically to life imprisonment, carrying the mandated possibility of parole after a designated statutory period. This specific legal maneuver initiated a relentless cycle of secondary, institutionalized psychological torture for the victim's family. The judicial system required Grammer to participate repeatedly in parole hearings, legally forcing him to reopen the deepest psychological wound of his existence every few years, simply to maintain the penal status quo and keep his sister's killer incarcerated. The 2014 hearing provides an unfiltered, highly documented public record of Grammer's internal processing mechanisms. Grammer declined physical attendance in the state of Colorado, opting instead to participate via a video conference link. The visual composition of this interaction carries profound psychological weight. Grammer, the internationally recognized television multimillionaire, appeared on a flat digital monitor within a high-security prison facility, looking downward at the aging inmate who slaughtered his sister 39 years prior. Geographic distance provided a necessary physical safety barrier, yet the psychological proximity remained absolute and highly volatile. Freddie Glenn addressed the monitor directly during the proceedings. He issued a formal apology, claimed profound remorse, attributed his violent actions to the impulsivity of youth and heavy narcotic consumption, and explicitly asked the Grammer family for forgiveness. Grammer's response functions as a masterpiece of psychological compartmentalization and semantic manipulation. He stated directly to his sister's murderer, "I accept your apologies. I forgive you. However, I cannot give my consent to your release. I cannot advocate for your release." Entertainment media outlets and celebrity journalists frequently cited this exchange as a profound demonstration of spiritual growth, emotional closure, and Christian grace. Rigorous clinical analysis reveals a much darker, far more complex reality. This statement completely lacks emotional healing. It represents the ultimate absolute assertion of psychological control. By utilizing the specific vocabulary of forgiveness, Grammer engaged in an act of clinical detachment. Theological and deep psychological forgiveness strictly requires relinquishing resentment and abandoning the desire for systemic retribution. Grammer relinquished absolutely nothing. He processed the apology intellectually, validated it on a superficial semantic level, and immediately weaponized it by retaining absolute penal authority. He granted spiritual absolution while explicitly denying physical liberty. He positioned himself simultaneously as the benevolent priest dispensing grace and the uncompromising warden turning the key. This specific interaction perfectly mirrors the exact operational framework he applies to his own trauma and severe chemical dependency. Grammer openly acknowledges his personal demons in heavily mediated environments. He speaks articulately about his historical addictions and familial tragedies during highly controlled press interviews. He intellectualizes his pain with extraordinary precision. He never truly surrenders to it. He keeps his trauma locked inside a highly secure, meticulously managed psychological cage, precisely as he demands Freddie Glenn remain inside a concrete cell. He maintains the ironclad conviction that he can grant forgiveness to the murderer without letting the murderer go free, entirely parallel to his belief that he can consume alcohol daily without letting the addiction run free. The 2014 parole hearing established the irrefutable fact that after 4 decades, Grammer remained fundamentally trapped within the paradigm of 1975, utilizing his massive intellect to manage the prison rather than attempting to escape the compound. The erosion of the public persona constructed during the sitcom years accelerated significantly following the conclusion of the original Frasier series in 2004. Upon the completion of its historic 11-season run, Grammer faced a critical professional and psychological precipice. The protective, highly lucrative corporate shield of Dr. Frasier Crane dissolved entirely. The network television apparatus no longer required his daily presence on a highly regulated soundstage. He faced the Hollywood ecosystem without the specific fictional character that had defined his entire adult existence and provided his daily structural anchor. Subsequent career choices heavily indicate his deteriorating internal state and his reliance on dark psychological mirroring. His most critically acclaimed performance in the post-sitcom era materialized in the Starz premium cable drama series, Boss, premiering in 2011. Grammer portrayed Tom Kane, the ruthless, deeply corrupt mayor of Chicago. The character of Kane functions as the exact psychological antithesis of Frasier Crane. Crane operated as a man who explicitly believed in the absolute power of communication, ethical psychiatry, and emotional transparency. Kane operates as a brutal, Machiavellian political architect who rules entirely through intimidation, systemic extortion, and calculated deception. Crucially, the central narrative engine of Boss revolves around Mayor Kane receiving a terminal diagnosis of Lewy body dementia. This condition is a severe, progressive neurological disorder characterized by terrifying hallucinations, rapid cognitive decline, and the complete loss of motor function. The character is a massive control freak whose own brain is actively mutating and destroying him from the inside out. He desperately attempts to hide his decaying mental state from his political rivals, his immediate family, and the voting public. He maintains a terrifying facade of absolute authority while privately collapsing into irreversible neurological chaos. Grammer's performance in Boss garnered universal critical praise, securing him a Golden Globe Award for Best Actor in a television series drama. The chilling authenticity of the performance stems directly from the fact that it required minimal theatrical acting. Grammer possessed intimate, first-hand familiarity with the exact pathology of Tom Kane. He had spent his entire adult life embodying a man terrified of losing control, a man utilizing immense corporate power and wealth to mask a profound internal disintegration. Playing a powerful public figure desperately hiding a fatal neurological breakdown from the world represented a dramatic high-definition reenactment of his own survival strategy during the absolute height of his cocaine and alcohol addiction on the Paramount studio lot. He simply traded the multi-camera sitcom laugh track for a prestige cable drama aesthetic, filtering his own historical trauma through a new fictional avatar. Simultaneously, the veneer of the sophisticated intellectual suffered systematic dismantling through his active participation in the reality television industrial complex. The highly publicized vitriolic divorce from his third wife, Camille Donatacci, heavily documented and manipulated for maximum ratings on the Bravo network's The Real Housewives of Beverly Hills, stripped away the remaining dignity of the Frasier illusion. The viewing public witnessed a bitter, emotionally detached aging man engaging in petty financial disputes, exposing his infidelities and orchestrating a remarkably cruel exit from his marriage on national television. The Harvard-educated psychiatrist vanished entirely, replaced by a standard chaotic tabloid spectacle. The meticulously constructed mask of control finally fractured permanently under the weight of an unscripted voyeuristic environment. The reality television cameras captured the absolute hollowness remaining when the scriptwriters stopped providing him with articulate dialogue. Evaluating the true legacy of Kelsey Grammer requires discarding the standard Hollywood redemption template. He offers no inspirational blueprint for recovery because he never genuinely pursued it in the clinical sense. Instead, his story stands as a complex monument to sheer brute force endurance within an opportunistic industry. NBC and Paramount didn't see a tragedy, they saw a billion-dollar asset. Instead of intervening, they simply paid the massive insurance premiums, building a television empire around a man who was actively self-destructing in plain sight. Kelsey Grammer utilized the exact resources provided by that machine to survive conditions that would have killed almost anyone else. He weaponized the television industry, using the brutal, relentless schedule of multi-camera sitcom production as a mechanical anchoring mechanism to prevent a total psychological freefall. He used the immense financial compensation to construct impenetrable legal and physical barriers around his private chaos, hiring elite fixers, publicists, and attorneys to manage the fallout of his addiction. He survived his chemical dependency not by submitting to medical intervention or spiritual surrender, but by financially out-earning the consequences. The System F functioned exactly according to its design. The corporation secured their syndication billions. Grammer secured his millions, his Emmy Awards, and his biological survival. The ultimate confirmation of this systemic entrapment materialized in 2023. At the age of nearly 70, Kelsey Grammer actively orchestrated, executive produced, and starred in a reboot of the Frasier series for the Paramount Plus streaming platform. The decision presents the final devastating psychological paradox. Entertainment journalists framed this revival as a nostalgic victory lap, a beloved actor returning to his most famous role to entertain a new generation. Systemic analysis demands a much harsher interpretation. A 70-year-old man possessing a net worth exceeding $100 million voluntarily chose to step back inside the exact fictional cage he constructed 40 years prior. He put the tailored suits back on, recited the familiar psychiatric jargon, and attempted to recreate the specific corporate environment that defined the most traumatic, chemically dependent era of his life. This reboot fails completely as a symbol of victory over his past or a triumphant reclamation of the character. It provides the absolute, irrefutable evidence that Kelsey Grammer fundamentally lacks an identity outside the parameters of Frasier Crane. The character consumed the host. Confronted with the vast, unstructured emptiness of his final decades, Grammer chose the safety of the Paramount soundstage over the terrifying prospect of silence. He chose to drown in a familiar, highly compensated illusion rather than face the profound void of his own reality. Frasier Crane remains immortal in the archives of television history, a perfectly preserved specimen of 1990s comedic brilliance, eternally frozen in a state of articulate anxiety. Kelsey Grammer remains an entirely different entity. He is a survivor of unimaginable familial violence, a master manipulator of his own public image, and a man who successfully conquered the most ruthless entertainment industry on the planet. He achieved all of this without ever truly leaving the El Paso County morgue in 1975. The entire trajectory proves with devastating clarity that an individual can be the smartest, most successful man in the room and remain fundamentally incapable of saving their own life.